say this was purely accident as we talked about that song and its correlation to Global Women's Day, which was Friday. One of my favorite women is my mother. And my mother has some significant cardiac issues last year. And one of the things that happened to her was that as she was being rolled from pre-op into surgery, her heart stopped and she died. But she came back. A few days later, she started sharing these experiences with me, what we often call NDEs, or near-death experiences. And we actually happen to have a researcher of those here in the house with us today, and I won't call her out, but if you ever had one of those and you want to share with somebody who does extensive research of that, Jen is in the back of the room at the moment. When Mom called me, the first thing she said, she's like, I want you to know it's true. The things you've been saying are true. I'm like, what, Mom? She said, I talked to God. And then she said, and I argued with God. Can you believe it? And I was like, yes, Mom, I can believe it. So that's my hard-headed woman segue right there. You know, this is one of those conversations and talks that I really wish that we were going to have today, like sitting down over a cup of coffee or tea, rather than like a public setting, because some of what's going to be shared is deep in my heart, and really because I'd want to hear your story, because it's our story and our experiences that make us who we are and really give validity to us. The first time that I ever walked in this, and I love this a wild soul sanctuary, that you can howl or not. There's no peer pressure either way, because I came from a spiritual background. When you was gathered, there were orders issued from up here. Let's stand and sing. Let's bow and pray. It really wasn't a lot of options. But I love that there's freedom to do this and to be ourselves. But the first time I walked in here, I walked in and I looked around and I thought, damn, this is just like church, just no cross. Because I come with, I don't know if it's religious trauma, but definitely religious disillusionment and disappointment. And oddly enough, it really started for me, it happened in a place where we think Yeshua, Jesus, I tend to call him his Hebrew name, a place where we think Yeshua was born, Bethlehem. In 2007, I resigned from the ministry I was working with and went to Bethlehem for several months to work with a local humanitarian aid organization. Now, I'll be honest with you, I didn't really know what I was getting into, which was a very good thing, because had I known of what it was going to cost me and what it was going to extract from me and the path it would put me on, I wouldn't have probably had the guts to do it. I went there and I thought that Bethlehem was in Israel. I'd gone through all the screening at the airport, and I go through, and the person that's driving me, they said, we're going through one more border crossing. Where's your passport? And I said, well, it's in my bag. And I was like, well, you've got to have it. And I was like, there's one more border crossing. Little did I know that I was going into the Palestinian territories. I didn't know that Bethlehem was in Palestine. I ended up spending several months there. And then I went back a few years later and spent almost 6 years in Palestine. And Palestine's making the news a lot these days. But I was working with a humanitarian aid organization that was part of a college. And my second day there, I walked outside the door, and I'm in vacation mode. I'm here like where Jesus was born and all this history and stuff happened. And I look across the street, and there are these strange concrete block buildings that are really discombobulated, dirty, and you could just kind of see the energetic funk over the place. And it was so in a place, I asked the guy with me, I said, what's that? He said, well, it's a UN refugee camp. I was like, refugees from where? He said, well, Jerusalem. I was like, well, Jerusalem is only 6 miles away. Why are those refugees from Jerusalem here in Bethlehem? And he started telling this story that I had not heard before about how in 1947 and 48, pre-Israeli paramilitary forces came in and drove people out of their homes using military power. So European immigrants would have an immediate place to live without construction costs or delays. Now, I had been a Christian minister. I still considered myself a Christian minister at that point. And I knew a lot about ancient Israeli history, about what happened 5,000 years ago and what happened 2,000 years ago. But I didn't know what happened 70 years ago. And he starts telling me, it's like, we see this wall, because we were like really right on the Israeli-Palestinian border. He said, you see this wall? He said, well, you know, it's really an affront to most people. It keeps deviating from UN lines and encroaching into Palestinian territory and taking land. I'd never heard that. He said, the president of the college who you met last night, he and his family lived in Jerusalem. And his father was a non-combatant standing out on his front porch and was shot and killed. He and his brother dragged his body inside. And then the next day they buried him in the backyard because had they gone outside, they would have been shot and killed too. Then their mother took their 7 siblings and divided them up to 3 different orphanages because she no longer had any economic support for them. And I kept hearing stories, and he told me about this, how illegal settlements are taking land. And he said, if you come with me this weekend, you'll meet this gentleman. His name's Rami. And part of his family's farm that had been in their family for generations has been taken. And I never heard any of this. Maybe you have. Maybe you come from a much more educated point than I did then. Every night I'd go to the top of those buildings, one of the buildings, and Mideastern architecture, flat roofs. And I'd sit up there and I'd pray. And across the street was one refugee camp. And then a few blocks behind was another that I could see. Bethlehem has about 14,000 people, 2/3 living of Bethlehem's population living in refugee camps. And really, I went with this very simplistic, compartmentalized perception of that situation of coming from a southern Christian environment. Israel's God's chosen people. And Palestinians are Muslims and terrorists. About 2 weeks in, I'd go up there and I'd pray, and I thought, God, what have I done to contribute to this narrative that's contributed to the persecution? And then a few days later, I just sort of collapsed in a puddle of tears one night, and I was like, God, do you even exist? The same people that told me about you, they also told me about this. They're wrong about this. Are they wrong about you too? And in very quick fashion, I decided I wasn't going to return as a Christian minister. I didn't know what I thought about God. I didn't know what I thought about Jesus. Certainly didn't have anything much good to say about the church. See, I'd put all my eggs in this one spiritual basket, spiritually and professionally. And all my eggs were falling out and breaking. And I didn't know what to do. And I was angry. And I was hurt. And I felt offended. And I didn't know why I had thought those things. And it led to a greater deconstruction pretty much of all my worldviews. Not only my spirituality and my faith, my profession, but also my politics. And it was a really traumatic event. Now, my guess is that some of you guys probably have some religious trauma and disillusionment. That's the reason we ended up here. We're a bit like a place of spiritual refugees. But we don't hold ourselves in a refugee status. We're a place of moving towards healing and wholeness. And while this trip into Bethlehem was by far one of the most traumatic things I've been through, it was also the best. Because it set me on a path, a different course that enabled me to being my authentic self. See, if you're like me, and really most of us are in this instance, we grew up in a family and we're taught really quickly and we learn really fast what we need to do to get love, acceptance, reward, and also what really brings the opposite of that. And because we're young and we can't defend ourselves and we're in this environment, we really, really quickly adapt and conform, even though we have no idea we're doing that. And we're being influenced we're put on our path, and we're being created by those around us. Now, some of us, we might have grown up in a really chaotic household. And you were always reading the room to see where the explosion would come next so you could head it off. We become an empath because we know what we're trying to stay 2 or 3 steps ahead of everybody just to prevent that explosion. And in that awareness and in that sensitivity of what's going on around us, to pursue our greater need of peace and of safety, we really end up denying ourselves a whole lot of the time. And as we age, people start asking, well, what do you want to do? What do you want to be? We don't really know. And sometimes they'll even ask, well, what do you like? And we've so denied ourselves in the pursuit of home, of a peace-filled home. We don't know what we want other than peace. And so we continue to grow and conform and maybe even very chameleon-like, which I was, and then we become people pleasers because that's what people like. But we never really get on that path of being our true self or our authentic self. And we just kind of go along, and usually it takes some kind of event in our lives to understand, what I've been doing just isn't working. Last weekend the board had a retreat and we shared different experiences from our lives, and people were very vulnerable and transparent in what they shared and what directed them in their spiritual paths and what got them here. And it's really a treasure and an honor to hear that and people to share those things. But often we might find ourselves in lives not knowing who we really are or what we want. Sometimes the worst thing I could have was like having a multitude of choices to pick from. It's like, really, I do good with 2 and really 1. A few years ago, I went through this program with this guy down in Albuquerque. His name's Richard Rohr. I don't know if any of y'all have heard of him, but I went through his 2-year living school. And he says our true self is who we were before we were born. And in his book, Falling Upward, which really talks a lot about this, it takes the last talk I did about how pain often moves us into growth. And it's an awesome book if you've not read it. It's called Falling Upward. But one of the things Richard talks about is how there are these blocks to being ourselves. And often it's these cultural exposure that we have, or the expectations of others. But sometimes it's also our own blocks. Oh, I can't do that. Yeah, she's really good, but I couldn't stand up here and do this. Or I couldn't create and make that. And we have these self-limiting thoughts. And some of them are the echoes of those that have been imposed upon us, or those voices in our head from a really long past that are still there. Oh, why are you doing that? That costs a lot of money. Isn't there other ways you could do that? And really, it's like and so these voices that we hear early in life, they really come with us. Richard calls it the crab bucket syndrome often, is that, I don't know if you've been to the coast and you've ever cooked crabs or caught crabs and they're trying to climb out of the bucket and they're going out, somebody grabs another one and pulls them back in. And unfortunately, people are often threatened and intimidated and don't like the change it's going to cause for them if we change us. And those around us in the crab bucket with us are pulling us back in. It usually takes a lot of courage and sometimes a lot of anger to really get to this point of following ourselves, but I think it really takes a place of spiritual growth to not be in that place of anger and just sheer rebellion and protest and fighting against. And I really had to work hard at that because I was really angry at the church because here I found myself in Palestine and what I had been exposed to or taught, nearly the opposite was what I was seeing. After I left there, I was back to the States for 6 months and really hated it. I went to England. I was like, I need to do another master's degree. I need to figure out something vocationally to somehow or another professionally connect the dots. So I was in England for a couple years. Back to the States for almost 3, working with an organization and their feeding program for our impoverished neighbors. But my heart, my true self, was back in the Middle East. Was back in Palestine. So I resigned and became my own nonprofit and went over and was there for almost 6 years. Working with people and really just listening to them and giving value to their presence. But it didn't come without great cost to some relationships I had. A lot of people didn't want me to go, especially family and those who were become dependent on me, or even not dependent, but just had expectations. And one of the things we'll often hear is like, oh, you're going to go do that? Well, what about me? That's really being selfish of you to go do that. But it's like, wait a minute. That sounds kind of selfish to me. In unity, there are 5 principles. And the 5th principle says that we are to live out our truth as we grow and ascend. We're to live that out. And see, if you happen to think like I do, we came to this earth with a plan and with a path and with a purpose. We often get derailed. But we came here to do certain things. And we had an awareness of that before we came. And it's when we don't live into that, when we don't feel that happening, we get into this place of misalignment, of feeling unfulfilled, that life is meaningless or it's boring. And then we usually try to fill it up with boats or cars or trucks or motorcycles or whatever. And that lasts for a little bit. But then we have to buy more. Oh, I know. Trust me, I know. You know, when Jane and I did a talk together a couple months ago, I shared about how we went to coffee, and then suddenly I found myself up here again. And again, and again. And some of you have come up to me and said, Kelly, thank you for the warning. It doesn't work. And I'm like, no, it doesn't work. And I'm like, I told you it doesn't work. That's the first thing I say. But the second thing I say is, I'm really glad it doesn't work. Because unity needs you. And it might be a slight chance that you need unity. Because this is a safe, creative split. And It's hard to believe I get paid to speak for a living. I'm coming for my water bottle. Thank you. Let me try this again. Unity, this is a safe place for you to explore and try to understand your gifts, your talents, and put them in a place of practice and thriving and growth. Now, Clara went through a few announcements this morning of what's going on, but there's a ton that's happening. And if you look at all this stuff and you're like, you don't have this. This needs to be happening. Great, you're in charge of that. I don't issue that as a warning. I issue that as a freedom and permission. That this is a safe place to grow and to be, and to take that being into a point of doing. That fifth principle, unity. This is Women's History Month, and it seems silly to me that we need a month to mark that, but I mean, if you were born from a woman, just raise your hand. And so, every year, I celebrate at least one day. But Maya Angelou is one of my favorite women also. Maya and I used to be neighbors, but she didn't know it. It was about 10 or 15 minutes away. But I tell people I'm her neighbor. I was her neighbor. And what Maya used to say was, and she meant this in a positive way, if you're going to live a legacy. Make a mark on this world that can't be erased. One of the local NPR stations was interviewing her one day, and they were asking about her propensity for authenticity, for speaking truth to power. And if you've ever read her poem, I Rise, that's such a powerful manifesto. And they asked her, they said, what brought you to being so brutally honest? And she's, I'm not brutal. Never be brutal anything. See, she was in this place despite all that she went through. And if you've known her history, it was tough. Where she was like, no, don't be brutal. Live into this place of being positive. Because really, what we need is we can rail and we can fight and we can protest against a lot of stuff. And I used to do a lot of protesting. I was in North Carolina, front lines of Black Lives Matter, front lines of refugee advocacy. In Israel, Palestine, right there with the crowd protesting. But we came to live in this higher vibration. And if we allow the events of this world to bring our vibration down, it contributes to the global collective. So really the best thing that we can do, whether it's Gaza or Ukraine or... Now what I really want to say about the current conflict in Gaza is the attacks that happened on October 7th were horrible. And I don't believe that you can look at that situation from a pro-Israel or pro-Palestine stance. A binary dualistic perspective will not get it for you. It only creates more division. It really needs to come from a place of being pro-peace. And the way that we can do that is raise our vibration first. And instead of protesting something that we're against, advocate for what we're for. Going back to Richard Rohr and what he would teach us, he would say, the best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. This clock hasn't been changed yet. I think I still have like another hour to speak. But I know I don't. But I just looked up and saw the time. The best practice of the bad, the best criticism of the bad is a practice of the better. It's living in our place of joy and peace. Abraham Hicks puts it this way, and it took me a really long time to get this. You can't suffer enough to make somebody else feel better. And I tried it. I was on the edge of the refugee camps. I was living in solidarity. I was living in poverty. I went 6 months without a washing machine, washing my clothes in a sink. Don't ever do that. Ever, if you want anybody who's close to you. Even by... But the best thing we can do as we look on these situations in the world is not get bogged down and brought down by the news, because if we all do, then the overall consciousness of this planet is going to plummet greatly. And what we came here to this earth to do is to raise our individual consciousness and vibration and contribute to the global consciousness and raising the vibration here on this planet. Last night, I was reading a little bit about Gaza just to be a little more informed, because really I just can't do it. I have friends, I don't have anybody in Gaza I know, but I have friends in the West Bank side and encouraging them. And I have friends, Israeli friends who live in Nazareth, Israeli Jewish friends who live in Nazareth. And they're involved in, and they're in their 80s and they're going out and marching against this war. And I'm trying to encourage and support them and engage in that acts of being supportive rather than protestive. But I was watching the news I was reading an article last night about this baker, this baker who bakes bread and cakes, specifically cakes in Gaza. He's down in Rafah, down there on the southern border, and he closed his bakery. And for a long time, he started opening his bakery just so people could come in and charge their phones. But it's like, I can't make cakes in the middle of war. I can't make cakes to people who are suffering and living in tents. But then a father came to him and said, "Can you bake a cake? My boy's birthday is next week and he's in the hospital." And this baker found flour on the black market and started baking cakes, because he realized that they still needed hope, they still needed joy, that he couldn't suffer enough to make anybody else feel better. African-American theologian and philosopher Howard Thurman, he put it this way. He said, don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you alive, and then go do it. Because what the world needs is people who've come alive. Thank you all. Namaste.